the earthly responsibility for his family. From the time that his father perished, until the age of 22, Jesus was the head and breadwinner of the house of Joseph. Because the carpenter's shop was at home and there was an existing clientele, Jesus decided to continue his father's carpentry business. If he had gone into salaried employment, he would not have been able to help his mother at home with housekeeping and child-rearing. Just to recap, Jesus had 8 brothers and sisters: James, Miriam, Joseph Jr., Simon, Martha, Judas, Amos and Ruth. In the early years, he made mostly furniture and agricultural tools such as wooden plows and yokes. A few years later, when his brother James left school, he went to work in the workshop, and Jesus was able to take on carpentry work outside the home. He specialized in finishing houses and did a lot of fine carpentry work such as installing windows, doors, shutters, and stairs. Later Joseph Jr. also entered the business and was trained by Jesus to be a carpenter. Simon became a mason, and Judas, after 12 trades and 13 accidents, eventually became a fisherman. And so this family managed to work their way out of poverty. Within a few years of Joseph's death, the family was forced to live very frugally and they run out of savings. School, living expenses, and tax costs exceeded the income from the carpentry workshop. As a result, the family's standard of living became more austere until finally, there were 3 breadwinners, and enough money came in again. Jesus was a real father to the younger children in the family. He spent every spare hour with the children, and they really loved him. Especially the Sabbath afternoon was a time of relaxation for the family. Jesus often took the children on long walks then. The children were always welcome in the workshop. Jesus always made sure there was sand, blocks, stones, and fresh sawdust next to the workshop. The neighborhood children would also settle down there to have fun. When they had had enough of their play, the boldest would peek into the workshop, and if its master was not busy, he would make the move to pull him out until he was sitting on his beloved rock by the corner of the workshop, with the children sitting in a half-circle on the ground in front of him. And how the little people enjoyed their father-brother or carpenter uncle. They learned to laugh heartily. Usually, some of the smallest children climbed on his knees, stayed there, and looked up in wonder at his expressive countenance as he told them stories. The children loved Jesus, and Jesus loved the children. After Joseph's death, Jesus and Mary got along better again. She regarded him less as a son, now he had become more like a father to her children. Daily life produced an abundance of practical, immediate difficulties. They spoke virtually nothing about his life's work, for as time passed, both their minds became entirely focused on the livelihood and raising of the 5 boys and 3 girls. Jesus had his own methods for raising children. He tried to emphasize the positive, doing good rather than forbidding doing evil. At home and during his public teaching, Jesus always used the positive form of exhortation. Always and everywhere, he emphasized that good is a command. He said, "You must do good," or "You should do that." He never used the negative form of teaching, which relied on taboos and prohibitions. He refrained from emphasizing evil by forbidding it. He elevated good by commanding the doing of good. Jesus already subjected his brothers and sisters to wise discipline at such a young age that it was rarely, if ever, necessary to give punishment. The only exception was Judas. On several occasions, Jesus found it necessary to impose punishment on him when he violated the rules of the house. Judas did not receive punishment until he himself confessed to the transgressions. The children were impressed by the spirit of fairness that animated their father-brother. He never demanded arbitrary obedience from his brothers and sisters. And this unchanging fairness and the fact that he always took personal factors into account made Jesus much loved throughout the family. All the children, especially the girls, usually asked Jesus for counsel regarding their children's problems, and they put as much trust in him as they would have done in a loving father. On Saturday afternoon, December 3rd of the year 12, death struck this family in Nazareth for the second time. Little Amos died after a week of high fever, not yet 6 years old. Their grief was intense. Jesus also went through a time of mourning, but at the same time he was a support and refuge for the other members of the family. Your Creator, as a human being, experienced the loss of a young child, and carried that emptiness with him throughout his earthly life. Now he is a loving, compassionate ruler who understands all the needs of his creatures. James developed into a well-balanced young man, but he did not have as much spiritual aptitude as Jesus. Joseph was a plodder and did not reach the intellectual and spiritual level of the other children. He was, however, a faithful worker. Simon was a boy with good intentions, but he dreamed too much. It took him a long time to find his place in life, and he gave Jesus and Mary much care. However, he was always a sweet boy who meant well. Judas always had the highest ideals but an unsteady temperament. He had all the decisiveness and enterprise of his mother, but he lacked much of her sense of proportion and her tact. Miriam was a well-balanced, sensible daughter with a lively appreciation for noble and spiritual things. She was pretty, perhaps the most beautiful girl in Nazareth. Martha was slow in thought and action, but a very reliable and practical child. Ruth was the sunshine in the house, always cheerful, though thoughtless in her speech. She was very sincere in heart. As a child she almost adored her big father-brother Jesus. Despite being tight for years, they did not cut back on education or Jewish nationality. All the boys finished synagogue school, and the girls were educated at home. When one of his younger brothers had finished school, Jesus would take him to the Paschal feast in Jerusalem, where he was then taken up as son of the law in the Jewish community. They then went on foot, and Jesus then taught them the same things that his father Joseph had also taught him. Always when he went to Jerusalem, he visited his friends in Bethany, where they were always welcome to stay overnight, or to share in the joy of Passover. It is certainly noteworthy that when Jesus was with James in Jerusalem, James urged Jesus to go to the temple debates. He secretly hoped that Jesus would participate in the discussions, as he had heard from the stories. So they went to the temple and listened to the discussions, but Jesus asked no questions. Now that Jesus had become a young adult, these debates, in his awakening human godly consciousness, appeared childish and insignificant. He could only feel pity. James was disappointed that Jesus said nothing. When he asked his big brother why he was not debating with him, Jesus only replied, "My hour has not yet come." And also the event during the Passover when the now 25-year-old Jesus had taken his brother Judas to Jerusalem, needs here some attention. Judas had a highly inflamed character, and in Jerusalem he worked himself into trouble when he heard a Roman soldier make an inappropriate remark to a Jewish girl. Judas became so indignant that he, in turn, scolded the soldier. However, the soldiers of the Roman legions were very sensitive to anything that bordered on disrespect on the part of Jews, and so this soldier immediately arrested Judas. This was too much for the young patriot, and before Jesus could exhort him to caution with a warning glance, he had already let loose in a loud torrent of pent-up anti-Roman feelings, which only made matters worse. Judas, with Jesus at his side, was immediately taken to military prison. Jesus tried to get Judas interrogated immediately or else released in time for the celebration of the Passover, but his efforts failed. Due to the busyness of the Passover celebration, Judas remained in custody for 2 days, and Jesus stayed with him in prison. They did not attend the ceremony in the temple in which the sons of the law were admitted into the full citizenship of Israel. It was several more years before Judas would undergo this formal ceremony. The morning after their second day in prison, they had to appear before the military magistrate. By excusing his brother on the grounds of his youthful age, barely 13, and a thoughtful explanation regarding the provocative nature of the incident that had led to the arrest, Jesus managed to steer the case in such a way that the magistrate believed that the young Jew might have had some excuse for his violent outburst. After warning Judas not to be guilty of such rash behavior again, he said to Jesus, "You had better keep an eye on him, he is capable of causing you much trouble." The Roman judge spoke the truth. Judas caused Jesus considerable trouble, and it was always trouble of the same kind, clashes with civil authority because of his rash and unwise patriotic outbursts. Back in Nazareth, Jesus told the family nothing about Judas' arrest in Jerusalem, but after 3 weeks he had a long conversation with Judas about this incident. After this conversation, Judas himself told it to the family. He never forgot the patience and forbearance his brother father had shown throughout this trying experience.